Please welcome to the stage author, educator, and Bloomberg Opinion contributor, Kyla Scanlon.
Hey everyone. Okay, let me make sure my slides are up here. Okay, cool. So hey everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the Young Investor's Guide to Markets, but I want to talk a little bit more than just that. So today I want to talk about the difference between data and reality, storytelling, and hope. So if you don't know me, I'm Kyla. I work with Bloomberg Opinion. I've done some work with the Financial Times, New York Magazine, and my whole goal is to help humanize finance, to humanize the economy, and hopefully that's what we'll do in this presentation today. So the difference between data and reality, what is going on? I feel like that's a question that all of us have been asking recently. What is going on with markets? What's going on with the economy? And how can we make sense of everything that is happening? So when we think about the gap between data and reality, there's a gap between expectations, theory, and reality, right? Like we have this idea in our head, how we expect things to be, then there's a gap between how things are supposed to be, the theory of it, and then how things actually are. And I actually have a screenshot of a tweet because I think this tweet really encapsulates this idea well. Mario games teach us that even if something is essentially the same, psychologically it can be completely different. And when we think about the economy and we think about the stock market, that line there is really important. Things can feel the same, or things are the same, but psychologically they can feel completely different than each other. And when we look at things like survey data, right, so the jobs reports or different sentiment indicators, the data can be really volatile. And when we have volatile data, that can make markets more volatile, that can make emotions more volatile, and that can ultimately make policy like that the Federal Reserve sets and other central banks more volatile too. And I promise I'll tie together all these thoughts in a second. And there was a survey that was released pretty recently going back to that expectations, theory, and reality of the number of Americans who feel good about their finances versus the finances of the overall economy. So a lot of people, 73% of people, feel great about their own personal situation. But when they look around at the world around them, they're like, this kind of sucks. Everybody is doing pretty bad except for me. So people are feeling pretty good about their own situation, but bad about the situation that they exist in, the world that they exist in. And this is a pretty important delineation for how we think about policy, for how we think about the economy, and for how we think about the stock market. This is a quote from the debt ceiling, the debacle that we all just lived through for, I think, the 79th time. Because when we think about this gap between expectations, theory, and reality, a lot of times policy is really important play into that, right? And this person who I think was anonymous said that they're only measuring the success of the debt ceiling based on how much we lost. And so when we think about policy like that, when you're measuring success only on how much you lost, that's going to really impact how people feel about the economy, the stock market, et cetera. And then there's other metrics too. So going back to that idea of expectations, theory, and reality, the labor market disconnect, it's really difficult to track available jobs. It's really difficult to figure out what numbers make sense and what we should actually be looking at. And then there's companies fluffing numbers. So corporate America's earnings quality, the worst in 3 decades. And that goes back to that expectation. And I promise I'll tie it all together. Expectations, theory, and reality. Companies are, their numbers are saying one thing, and maybe the reality of how the stock is doing, how the company is actually doing is completely different. And of course, when we talk about companies and performance, we have to talk about inflation too. So this is a tweet from Nick, who is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, talking about this underlying theory of inflation. Is inflation coming from companies price gouging? Is inflation coming from outsized consumer demand? It all ties back into that expectations, theory, and reality thesis. Corporations are people too. I think this is also an important line, this idea that a society in which it's easier to protect shareholder rights than civil rights, because going back to Nick's point, are corporations price gouging? Where is this inflation coming from? We have to have a big conversation about what it means to actually be like a person in the economy. And this is like an interesting line because what does that mean? And then this, I think, is the final slide in this section. Because when I feel like I've been sort of talking, obviously, about the expectations, theory, and reality, and a lot of that dives into narrative, right? A lot of that dives into the story that we're telling about the stock market, the story that we're telling about the economy, and whether that ties back into people's actual lived experiences. Because when we think about the narrative of the stock market, a lot of it is based on the idea of appearances, where we're molding reality to whatever narrative the stock market wants it to have that day. I'm sure we've all seen the headlines where it's like an oil rig blows up and the stock market goes up. And that's like a weird thing to read about, and it's a weird thing to feel. So this is the short-term garbage raccoonifications of markets, where we get really focused on the short term within markets, within the economy, that we often forget about the long term. We forget about what actually matters, right? And the short-term garbage raccoonification of markets is ultimately really net harmful, and can tie back to that idea of expectations, theory, and reality. So the data that we look at, so going back to the slides about the jobs report, inflation, et cetera, the data that we look at isn't always representative of the reality that we exist in. I'm sure all of us have seen that, even if it's just like the jobs report, where we have people on Twitter being like, the jobs report isn't real. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice the data that we see, and what's really important is how people feel about it and the expectations that they ultimately have about it as well. So this next part is going to be about storytelling. So the art of storytelling, and I promise this slide has a point too. I'm sure this is like what's it doing at a finance conference? But there's something in storytelling called ritual banality avoidance. And that's the idea that when you're writing a story, you don't make it really easy on the reader. Like, you don't just make two characters fall in love. You have to set the expectations for the reader as they're reading the story. So by the time the two characters do fall in love, they're like, oh, that I had to work for that. Like, I had to read through that. I had to not make assumptions. You have to create expectations as a writer that then your readers can follow. And markets are storytellers, right? Like, we all just lived through the debt ceiling debacle, where the debt limit breach begins to worry investors. But when you think about the debt limit itself, right, like the debt ceiling, for however you feel about it, it's ultimately a story. It's not something that necessarily needs to exist. It's creating expectations, it's creating the storyline, it's creating this narrative that ultimately we all have to prescribe to. And when you look at this is credit default swaps rate. That's a story. That's a storyline that the market is telling people about this debt limit breach and the worries that investors are having. And then I want to zoom out a little bit here. So we're talking about the markets, we're talking about the economy, and I think it's really important to zoom out to the meta level. What stories are we telling as a capital S society? So this is a tweet about the Super Mario Bros. Movie. It was like a huge, huge hit, but it was based in nostalgia, right? Like, it was based in this revision to the past. And when we, as a society, capital S society, and when we get really stuck in that loop of always repeating the same exact stories in the same movies and doing the same things all the time, we have stagnation. It becomes really difficult to progress. And going back to that idea of expectations, theory, and reality, expectations become stagnant, and therefore we sort of become stagnant. So it's really important to tell good stories. And going back to the debt ceiling too, it's all super important to tell good stories about what we're doing. And the reason that Super Mario Bros. And the idea of nostalgia is so valuable is because our attention is really valuable. We're very expensive. Our eyeballs are very expensive. Ads are a big deal. And our eyeballs are commodities. And a lot of the things that we end up paying attention to ends up being monetized distraction, right? So when we think about nostalgia in Super Mario Bros., it's a lot easier to repeat those things rather than trying to come up with new and innovative things. This gets into the next aspect of hope and just storytelling in general, expectations, theory, and reality. There's doomerism. So when we think about our eyeballs being commodities, it's very, very profitable to tell people bad things, to make people afraid. Because if you're like, hey, the world's going to end, subscribe to my newsletter, people are going to do that. And there's this concept of doomerism that I think is just fascinating. I'm sure all of you have run into it, where people are telling you the world is going to end. It's this big combination of entertainment and brain stuff, right? Like, our brains love being afraid. It's just how we're built. And then community. People are seeking out leaders. People are seeking out community. We're lonely on net. And then there's aspects of nihilism to that too. And in red on the screen, I have things that are bad, right? Like, there are elements of doomerism that are completely warranted. But then on screen, I also have things that are in green that are good. So with doomerism, it's this really tough balance, and the important thing to remember with it is that our eyeballs are commodities, and people are trying to set certain expectations to get you to sort of manifest a certain reality. And then the biggest thing to combat doomerism and the negativity is to be optimistic, right? Like that sounds so silly and so easy, but it pays more, both in money and in life, and we owe it to ourselves and those around us to be optimistic, to be forward-looking, to be excited about all the cool things that we get to experience, and that is the easiest way to combat doomerism and to tell better stories. And of course, going back to the very first slide, expectations, theory, and reality, we are lonely, and we do tell stories that make us lonelier. This is a graph of media sentiment, and you can see that the news headlines that we're reading, I think this is very commonly known, are negative. And the thing that we can do to sort of combat all of this, right, like to combat the negativity and headlines, which are almost unavoidable. I mean, look at the sky outside, right? You have to be curious, and I think this article from The Defector is really good, where we have, billionaires who, it's really cool to go up into outer space, but there's also an element of curiosity that we can begin to encourage on a local level, allowing people to go after their passions, and that goes into the next thing, meaning. This was a piece in Harper's, The Age of the Crisis of Work, where meaning isn't always going to be attached to work, right? Like we have to be able to provide tools to people where they can find meaning outside of their workplace, because work from home, it's all changing, and I think there has to be a way that we allow people to be curious, to have meaning outside of traditional structures as it's always, quote unquote, been done. And then I think this is just an important thing too, this idea of words versus concepts, where a lot of people get confused about a word, they'll get angry at a headline, not maybe understand the underlying concept that is trying to be told, and then narrative, so going back to like just sort of tying everything together, because I know it sounds a little disparate, we have to tell better stories, because we ultimately are stories. Like humans have forever been sitting around campfires and telling each other stories. And so I think that's just an important thing to remember, is that the stories that we tell, the expectations that we set, the theories that we subscribe to end up driving the reality that we exist in, because we're all a part of the marketplace of ideas. Like this is, I think, super important to remember. Existing in the past is easier than engaging in the present. Nostalgia is going to drive us. We all love to have memories, but we have to remember that it's important to look forward. We've also commoditized ourselves a certain bit to the point where we are what we consume. And then I think this is important too, we've assetized our feelings to get them value on the sociological marketplace. And this is I'm gonna skip this because I'm out of time. But this is, I think, the important thing to remember too, the hope function. So sort of tying together this, I guess, wide-ranging presentation, the idea of hope, right? Like that is the thing to combat doomerism. That is the thing to tie together expectations, theory, and reality. And I know that sounds like very naive, right? To be like, oh, we just need to have more hope. But I think the way that we think about hope is really important too, especially in context of markets, especially in context of the economy, the context of society at large, is that hope has to be future-facing, and we have to tell better stories about what we're looking towards. We have to be endlessly curious and encourage those around us to be curious as well, and realize that hope is defeatable. It's not going to be this perfect thing, and that is a-okay. But yeah. So that this is also a quote I like. I really like quotes. If you read my newsletter, I have a bunch of them in there. So we cannot constrain anyone who is unwilling to follow the new direction of the question. We can only extend the field of the vision of the asker, loosen his prejudices, guide his gaze in a new direction. But all of this can only be achieved only with his consent. So I think that's the other thing too, is community and realizing that you have to connect to those around you and be curious. But yeah, thank you.